Welcome to Libyth. Today we are in Heian, Japan, and today is our last stop in this particular series, which means today is the episode where we step back from the individual threads we have been pulling, structure, voices, philosophy, and ask what holds the entire fabric together once you look at it from a slight distance. We are going to spend this final episode with the two organizing categories that govern the whole collection: nature and love, and with the formal craft, the actual technical machinery of language, that this poetic tradition developed to carry those categories with the precision and weight we have spent this whole series admiring. Think of this as the episode where the architecture, the voices, and the philosophy we have already discussed all get tied into a single working system, and where we finally look closely at the tools, not just the ideas, that made that system possible. Let's begin with the two-category structure itself, nature and love, because we have referenced it throughout this series without ever sitting with it directly as its own subject. 20 books, the entire collection, and yet nearly everything in it reduces to one of these two governing domains: the seasonal cycle running from spring through winter, and the emotional cycle of human attachment, longing, and loss collected under the heading of love. This is worth treating as more than simple convenience, more than just two topics an editor happened to find useful for sorting poems. This two-category structure became the template, repeated with only minor variation, across every one of the 21 imperial anthologies that followed the Kokinshu over the next 3 centuries. Think about what that means practically. For 300 years, every official, state-sanctioned attempt to define the boundaries of legitimate Japanese poetic subject matter kept returning to this same fundamental division: the natural world and the experience of human attachment, as though these were not simply two convenient organizing categories, but the two genuinely exhaustive domains poetry was understood to properly address. This is, in the most literal sense possible, the operating system of an entire literary tradition, installed once in this single anthology, and then run with only superficial updates for centuries afterward. And once you accept that framing, look again at what this operating system quietly excludes, because exclusion, as we discussed in our structural episode, is itself a meaningful choice, not simply an absence. Political content, in any direct or explicit sense, is excluded. Economic content, the material realities of land, labor, and taxation, we spent an entire episode mapping out as the actual lived backdrop of this poetry's composition, is excluded. Even extended narrative, story in the conventional sense, is excluded, confined to the margins of what this tradition considered properly poetic territory. What remains, occupying the entire available space, is nature and feeling, treated as though these two domains together constitute the complete and sufficient subject matter of serious poetry. This is an enormously consequential definitional choice, made once by a small handful of compilers working under imperial commission, and then inherited, almost without challenge, by every subsequent generation of court poets for the next 300 years. We are not simply describing a poetic preference here. We are describing the construction of an entire tradition's sense of its own proper boundaries that would shape what counted as poetry, and by extension what counted as a properly Japanese aesthetic sensibility, for an extraordinarily long stretch of literary history. Now let's turn to the books outside this central nature and love division, because they deserve more attention than a quick footnote, even though they occupy comparatively less structural space. The books devoted to felicitations, to partings, to travel, to laments, These are the categories handling everything in human experience that is neither purely seasonal nor purely romantic. The formal social occasions, the ceremonial obligations, the specific griefs of departure and death that structure an aristocratic life, lived inside a tightly bound court society. We have already spent real time with travel, back in both our reading episode and our structural episode, tracing how thoroughly that category's characteristic melancholy reflects the actual social geography of Heian, Japan, the capital as the only place that mattered, the provinces as displacement and exile. The felicitations and laments deserve a brief word here too, because together they bracket the entire range of formal social occasion this poetry was expected to serve. Poems for celebration, marking births, promotions, auspicious events worth marking with appropriately composed and appropriately restrained verse, and poems for mourning, marking departures from life itself with the same disciplined, compressed, image-driven technique we have seen applied to every other form of loss across this collection. These books remind us that the Kokinshu, for all its philosophical ambition around nature and transience, was also, simultaneously, a practical, functional document, supplying the actual verses an aristocratic court required for the actual occasions aristocratic life generated: congratulation, farewell, grief, each one needing its appropriately crafted poetic response. Which brings us, finally, to the formal devices themselves, the actual technical machinery this tradition built to make all of this compression, all of this image carrying emotion without stating it directly, possible at the level of individual language. We have talked, across this entire series, about poems that locate enormous feeling inside small physical images, but we have not yet looked closely at how the language itself accomplishes that compression, and it is worth doing so now, because these techniques are not decorative flourishes. They are the actual engineering behind everything we have admired in this poetry so far. Consider the Makurakatoba, the so-called pillow word, a fixed, traditional epithet, typically 5 syllables long, that attaches itself to certain words or phrases almost automatically. The way certain adjectives in English have become permanently fused to certain nouns through sheer repeated usage. These epithets likely began, generations before the Kokinshu, as something closer to ritual or magical formulas, carrying a kind of incantatory weight tied to specific beliefs about the power inherent in particular combinations of words. By the time of this anthology, that ritual weight had softened into something closer to formal poetic convention, a recognizable signal announcing that a particular kind of word or image was about to appear, giving the listener a moment of anticipatory recognition before the actual content of the line arrives. Consider, too, the Jakatoba, the introductory phrase, functioning similarly to the pillow word, but without its fixed, formulaic character, composed freely for each individual poem rather than inherited as a set phrase, serving the same basic function of building toward a key image or expression, but allowing the poet far more flexibility in how that build-up gets constructed and how long it runs. Then there is the device that, more than any other, reveals just how seriously this tradition took compression as a craft principle in its own right. The cake katoba, the pivot word, a single word carrying 2 distinct meanings simultaneously, made possible by the relative phonetic simplicity of the Japanese language and its resulting abundance of homophones, words that sound identical while meaning entirely different things depending on context. A skilled poet could place a single word at the exact pivot point of a poem and have it function, simultaneously, as the conclusion of one image and the opening of an entirely different one, doubling the poem's effective content without doubling its length, asking the listener to hold 2 meanings active at once inside a single sound. This is compression taken to something close to its logical limit, an entire technique built around making one word do the structural work of two, quietly reinforcing each other's secondary meanings throughout the entire composition. Finally, and this is the device most directly connected to everything we have discussed across this entire series about voices, recurring figures, and the weight of literary inheritance, there is honkadori, the technique of deliberately weaving words or phrases from an earlier, already celebrated poem into a new composition, allowing the new poem to carry forward and quietly invoke the accumulated emotional and cultural weight of the earlier masterpiece it is echoing. This is worth pausing on directly, because it connects everything we said 2 episodes ago about Tsurugi naming the 6 poetic sages, about canon formation as a quiet but durable exercise of cultural power, directly down into the smallest unit of the craft itself, the individual poem. Honkadori only works, only carries weight, if there is already an established canon of recognized earlier masterpieces sophisticated listeners would actually recognize being echoed. The technique presupposes exactly the kind of canon Tsurugi's preface was helping to construct and formalize. Nothing in this poetic tradition, the device itself seems to insist, stands entirely alone. Every new composition exists in conversation with, and is partly constituted by, the masterpieces that came before it, echoing them, extending them, drawing borrowed weight from them rather than starting from nothing. And here is where I want to draw the entire series to a close, because this final formal device turns out to be the clearest possible expression, at the smallest possible scale, of the exact same idea we spent our entire previous episode excavating at the largest possible scale. Honkadori says, in the compressed language of a single poem, nothing stands alone, everything echoes something earlier. Meaning is built through resonance with what came before rather than through pure, isolated, self-sufficient originality. Nothing beautiful stands permanently on its own either. Everything passes, everything echoes forward into loss. And the only way to hold that fact steady is through the disciplined, compressed, carefully crafted act of naming it precisely. The way a poet names a falling blossom or a darkening sleeve, rather than simply announcing sadness in the abstract. Form, in other words, repeats theme, all the way down, from the largest structural architecture of the entire 20-book collection, to the smallest individual technique a single poet might use inside a single 31-syllable verse. An anthology obsessed, at every level with transients, builds itself out of techniques explicitly designed to make every individual element echo something that came before it, exactly the way every blossom echoes every other blossom that has ever fallen, exactly the way every grieving lover in these pages echoes every other grieving lover the collection has already shown you. The Kokinshu is not simply a book about impermanence. It is built, from its largest architecture down to its smallest verbal device, as a continuous demonstration of how something can be made to last, can be made to echo forward across centuries, precisely by being honest, with extraordinary formal discipline, about the fact that nothing actually does. That's all for today on Libyth. One new book every week. At least we try.